Afghan male asylum seekers posing as child pupils in Dublin school, teacher alleges to the Irish Inquiry. They look in their 20s. They came here claiming asylum, saying that their parents were killed and that they have no documents. This is the claim of an Irish teacher who has contacted the Irish Inquiry with concerns that a group of pupils at a Dublin secondary school are grown men posing as children. They went on to say, they don't speak much English, they could be anyone. To be honest, it's probably happening more than we think. I know of 2 cases where this is happening. If they have no documents, they can easily claim to be a minor, and how can the state prove otherwise? The teacher claims that these men are obviously adults in their 20s. They have serious concerns that these students have access to female minors and say that it's potentially a loophole for paedophiles to sit in classrooms with teenage girls. Also this week, a separate report was made to the Irish Inquiry about a detention centre for minors where it is claimed that a migrant who is being held there for kicking a man to death is, according to the person who made contact, unmistakably an adult male in their mid-20s. This detainee has been described in court as being at very high risk of reoffending and being fully cognizant of their actions. They could be out in as little as 5 years. However, had they been convicted as an adult, they would have likely received a life sentence. Whether they would have served it or not is another thing, but they probably would have served more time than they're going to serve in this instance. In the meantime, he's residing in a volatile environment with boys under 18. The claims of both these people cannot be dismissed. Yet what are they supposed to do? If they suspect that there are adults in their classrooms, well, it's the schools and services to the Gardaí and the government departments that have facilitated these anonymous adults in the first place. So whistleblowing is not so straightforward in this situation. It's easy for us to say they should do A, B and C, but they have bills to pay, roofs to keep over their heads and children to feed. The only thing they could do to highlight this issue is really contact a media platform that won't run cover for the state. If the idea of adult men with absolutely no background checks sitting in classrooms seems far-fetched or too nightmarish to comprehend, then you need to understand that while Irish authorities may not publicly acknowledge that migrants are posing as children, they are nonetheless fully aware that this is happening. It's a very prevalent problem in countries such as the UK, France, Greece, and the United States. Shockingly, in the UK, the government have been using what they call a Challenge 25 policy, meaning migrants are only challenged on claiming to be a child if they look over 25. The last time I checked, being a child was under 18. Now, why would it be any different here than it is in the UK? The UK government and intelligence services will have been fully liaising with the Irish authorities about such matters as well. However, the Irish government will be happy to keep stum and allow our children to be put at risk in their own schools. After all, many of the more sensible Irish people out there have been disquieted for some time now, and this growing sense of unease has the potential to cause trouble for the puppets at Leinster House, whose collective conscience, if they ever had one, has been effectively dislodged to make way for the United Nations and EU agendas. The hands of those entities are now firmly nestled in the anal cavities of Varadkar and co. While parents are rightfully worried about trafficking centres and the men in them being adjacent to schools, the reality is those men could be sitting beside your son or daughter in their classroom. I imagine the government is as smug as they are relieved that the public have not yet realised this total horror situation. To understand the potential extent of the problem, let's look at our neighbours across the pond. Last year, the Home Secretary at the time announced the introduction of a new scientific advisory committee that would provide advice on checking how old an asylum seeker is. Priti Patel was quoted as saying, "The practice of adult men masquerading as children claiming asylum is an appalling abuse of our system. These adult men go on to access children's services and schools through deception and deceit, putting children and young adults in school and care at risk." Before we go on, it's important not to give ex-Home Secretary Patel much credit here, as the only reason children are in that position is directly because of the open border policy and actions of the British government. 2/3 of age disputes in the UK are now revealing that, on average, 3/4 of asylum seekers whose ages were in question were in fact adults. It's been reported that smugglers are actively debriefing adult men, instructing them to claim they are under 16. Recently, it emerged in the UK that an adult Afghan double killer successfully posed as a 14-year-old. He then went on to stab aspiring Royal Marine Thomas Roberts to death. Lawangeen Abdul Rahimzi's asylum application was rejected, and despite knowing this, the UK government granted him permission to stay in the UK after he claimed to be an unaccompanied child fleeing the Taliban. The truth is that he was a grown man who had gunned down 2 Serbians with a Kalashnikov. He also had a drug dealing conviction in Italy, where he had resided for a time. The UK government accepted his fake backstory after he entered the country from France, where he had also been a resident. They did so despite him repeatedly not showing up for interview appointments and despite his refusal to disclose documents he was asked to produce. Abdul Rahimzi was placed with a female foster carer and was given a place in a local secondary school. Shortly after his arrival, he posed with a knife on TikTok and was filmed on Snapchat assaulting a man. In court, he said he believed it was his right to carry a knife. Other notable cases where adult migrants were facilitated in accessing schools include the case of adult Iraqi Ahmed Hassan, who posed as a 16-year-old. Hassan set off a bomb on a London tube train, injuring 23 people. In another case, Iranian Sivash Shah was placed in a secondary school with 15-year-old children, despite being a man clearly over the age of 30. He was only pulled out of school when parents threatened to boycott, but the government continued to award him the special privileges and protections of a minor even after he was removed from the school. One UK foster couple say several adult males were sent to them over the years, and they claim they would be frequently asked for razors. One of their placements said to them, "You English are so stupid. I'm in my 20s." As a result, they reported that man to the social services, but no action was taken. Now the UK is talking about employing the use of x-rays, scans and dental assessments to determine age. The proposed measures are to be put before Parliament. In France and Greece, similar methods are already being used. Unsurprisingly, NGOs and charities are up in arms about the UK government verifying age. They argue there have been many cases where children have been wrongly identified as adults, and say children will be deterred from travelling to claim asylum because they will fear such tests, which they claim can be inaccurate. But if those they refer to are underage, why would they want those children to make very dangerous crossings overseas in the first instance? There is a very real risk of drowning. If you didn't already know, NGOs are funding and facilitating the crossing of those boats into EU countries. This is exposed in the documentary Borders. Adults make an informed choice to get in those boats. They know the risks. Children wouldn't be able to make the same informed choice. So if children are crossing waters aided by NGOs, then surely there is criminal culpability in terms of endangerment of children. It's also surely criminal to be organising for people to pass into countries illegally, although NGOs get around the last part by coaching people on what to say at border security to ensure they will be granted asylum, which is probably also illegal. They only differ from smugglers insofar as they are not making money from migrants. They steal their money from taxpayers instead. NGOs and charities argue children can end up in adult facilities if they are determined incorrectly to be over 18. And while this is a valid worry, they don't seem to have the same concerns for British children and indeed migrant children who may be at risk of having adults placed in their care facility or school, or for those children in foster placements who may also be put at significant risk. Perhaps there may be the possibility of some inaccuracy in testing. However, MRI and CT scans tend to be reliable, although the British Dental Association does think it's inappropriate to use dental tests to determine the age of migrants. However, none of the proposed tests are particularly invasive and they do not pose any physical risk. NGOs and charities assert that migrant culture and traditions would mean that such tests are threatening. However, if you want to be accommodated in a new country, then you should have to concede to certain measures. And if it's so dangerous in your own country of origin, then a few tests would not be a deterrent. While testing would appear to be the only solution, albeit an imperfect one, I imagine anyone threatened with deportation as a result may then travel to Ireland. After all, no one is checking anyone here and no one has any plans to do so. And just to say, obviously, the other solution would be just not to let people in, particularly people who are not background checked. To digress for a minute, many of these NGOs and charities are human rights organisations that stayed silent when the general public was being coerced into highly invasive and potentially risky medical procedures during the past few years. They also kept quiet when blanket do not resuscitate orders were being rolled out during that time for people who had Down syndrome and other such conditions. That was essentially a eugenics type cull. These were DNRs put into place without consent for people who hadn't even caught the cold when the DNRs were put into place. The UK Care Quality Commission found that these orders resulted in avoidable deaths. Most NGOs and charities had nothing to say about that, so they really need to dry their eyes about this migrant issue, especially as it's evident that a high number of people claiming to be children in the UK are clearly adults. As human rights organisations, it would behove them to care about the rights of actual children. You'll have virtue signalling types that will say you cannot label such migrants a risk just because they are posing as children. It doesn't mean they are automatically rapists or paedophiles or terrorists, etc. Yes, that's true, but we have no idea who they are. And the very fact that they have posed as children is precisely why they are a risk. Regardless of their intent, even if that intent is just to have a better life for themselves, they have acted in an extremely duplicitous manner to achieve that, and that in and of itself warrants deep suspicion. They have not been transparent. They have gone to lengths to conceal their identity and create emotionally manipulative background stories, inserting themselves amongst innocent children in the process. They have removed from children their right to be in an environment of trust where they can be safe in the knowledge that all adults are appropriately background checked. Furthermore, some of these men could indeed have violent and extremist backgrounds. This is very plausible, and those who are that way inclined tend not to abandon their fundamentalist causes. If even one person such as this has entered the school system, then that's a cause for uprising if we didn't have one before now. Just think, parents are sending their kids to school thinking all adults that surround them are checked, as is their right to expect so. The last thing they expect is that their Johnny or Mary might be sitting next to adult pupils who are concealing their past, let alone be sitting next to Jihadi John. I can only imagine there have been some concerns raised, but likely they are dismissed out of hand. Schools act in loco parentis, but increasingly schools are not places we can trust anymore. There are obviously several reasons for this, which are aside to the issues being discussed here. Many parents are now at least aware of those issues, like gender ideology, but they're not aware of this issue that I speak of here. They could also be in residential homes and foster placements. Think about the possibility of that, coming off the back of the Rotherham-style grooming gang scandal that has seen very vulnerable girls in care homes be systematically raped and abused. And I believe there was one special needs boy as well who was aged 12. And to clarify, the UCD study that exposed what is happening refers to the culprits as a Rotherham-style gang. So they're not my words or my assumption, but that was bad enough. Can we take a moment to acknowledge at this point that what went on, and is probably still going on in those places, happened in mostly private care homes? Most people don't know that. So, like with the profit making of the human trafficking centres, you have a similar outsourcing of care, and I use that word very loosely. It's not altruistic, it's greed. Some of these companies are American multinationals. In my opinion, this means that what happens to these kids is less likely to get reported, as there are profits on the line and contracts to be kept. I've written to TUSLA asking them for clarity on tenders, and they have not been forthcoming. I will elaborate more on that at another time, but for now let's go back to the issue at hand. A few months ago, there was one mainstream article posted on Twitter where they pointed out that some migrant had been refused a place in an Irish care home because the social worker had concerns regarding the age of someone claiming to be a child. Now, I cannot find that article anymore, and I wonder was it subsequently scrubbed from the internet to hide the fact that adults who are coming in as asylum seekers may be posing as children. But in any case, I wouldn't be surprised if the social worker was ultimately overruled. This social worker clearly had a duty of care to a whole group of already vulnerable children, versus only prioritising the needs of someone they doubted was a child at all. I recall very idiotic comments underneath from the usual everyone is welcome, no checks needed types, it was racist and it was terrible and it was shocking and he should be accepted at his word. Not a single thought or regard for the children who are being safeguarded by this move, many of whom would be migrant children. We really have to stop tolerating this kind of lethal stupidity. When it comes to age, there must be 100% certainty. And for the very stupid people in the back, I'll say that again. When it comes to age, there must be 100% certainty because the safety of children is at stake. Given how shocking TUSLA is as an organisation, I'd say that social workers like the one described here are few and far between. And that's very bad news for children in care homes who quite often are the most vulnerable children in society and they have nobody to look out for them. Absolutely nobody. And these are the types of children who end up being exploited or targeted for sexual abuse or exploitation. As I said, private care homes are even less likely to care about anything other than profit margins, and so I determine they will be hardly likely to question the status quo. More migrants mean their beds are always full. Will they care if some of those migrants look excessively mature for a 14, 15, 16 or 17-year-old? It is very difficult to know what we can do for those children. None of us have access to those facilities or even know where they are. What we do know is that unaccompanied children are going missing from these places. Who knows exactly how many really are children, given what we're talking about here, but at least some of them must be. On June 30th, 2023, I wrote to TUSLA asking them to declare how many children are missing from care in Ireland. I also asked them many other questions which they neglected to answer. They did tell me how many children were missing from care, but only as far back as 2021, and before laying out the actual figures, they took great care to say the following. Due to the vulnerable nature of children in care, TUSLA prepares an absence management plan for each child in care. This plan assesses the risk of a child going missing. During all our care planning work, consideration is given to whether there are indicators or extra vulnerabilities relating to exploitation. Given the Mail on Sunday story on Sunday the 8th of October, where they describe children in care being trafficked into sex slavery in Ireland, it's almost as though this reply was an anticipatory defence, as they knew the story would emerge. I also think they knew what I was getting at, which was I was trying to find out if children are being trafficked in Ireland, which of course they are, and I knew that. But I was writing an article a couple of months before this letter called The Stolen Child, where I spoke about how I felt there would be a Rotherham type grooming gang and went through all the cases of unaccompanied minors coming into the country where they've been trafficked and the guards have done nothing. And I suppose TUSLA knew exactly what I was getting at. And everything that I outlined in that article has since actually come to pass. So any predictions I made, and it's not because I'm particularly good at making predictions, but because this is common sense now with the way everything is going and people coming in and not being background checked. And coming from countries such as Ukraine, where there is a very high rate of child trafficking. I think they've the highest rate of child trafficking of any country in Europe. So it's inevitable that we're going to end up with this problem. And we have done, and our own children are going to be at risk now too. But back to TUSLA. They were very careful to reassure me that children are not being trafficked directly from care homes. But obviously they are being trafficked from care homes. They went on to disclose to me that a total of 16 unaccompanied minors are missing in Ireland. They also were very quick to point out that of all the other children that have gone, missing, they have been found, but that of the children that have gone missing, that it's possible they just went off and did their own thing. So they're kind of washing their hands of any accountability there. They've got to take responsibility for the fact that they were supposed to be looking after these children. Now, why are they also only given the figures as far back as 2021? So I will ask you this. What is to stop traffickers posing as children to gain access to these care homes? And the answer is nothing. I've often said to radical leftists at protests, if you support unfettered access to our country, then you support child trafficking. The two are intrinsically linked. which of course they aggressively and conveniently dismiss. As for the more sensible amongst us, there is not a whole hell of a lot, as I said, that we can do other than write fruitless letters to our representatives highlighting concerns and seeking clear answers about why the age of individuals is not being determined, nor their background. Although if their background is determined, well then automatically their age is likely to be determined accurately. When it comes to schools, as parents, we need to take a look at the pupils that are in our child's educational setting. Often with teens, they make their own way to their place of education, or their parents drop them off outside the school gates. And as such, parents end up not seeing most of their child's classmates. So pick a day and make it your priority to accompany your child into their school, even if it embarrasses them. Better they be embarrassed than be unsafe. Some schools don't allow parents inside unless there's a specific event or meeting, and if that's the case, pick a morning or afternoon and sit outside and observe students coming and going. If you have a good relationship with your teen, explain your concerns and ask them if they've noticed any new pupils appearing a lot older than they claim. Raise any concerns you have with the principal and do not be dismissed. Explain to them how adults posing as children is a very common problem in the UK and other countries and show them evidence of this. If you have strong concerns and meet resistance, make it very clear you will not go away, and that any egregious breach of trust or risk to your child's safety will be addressed with every bit of your might. Remind the school of their obligations and pointedly ask